Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Of all the Easter stories, Mark's is the most mysterious. It's the one that leaves us wondering what happened that day and wanting to know the rest of the story. I know it's Luke's turn this year to tell the Easter story, and we're supposed to let him bring in this wonderful day, but I find that I'm still thinking about Mark and the way his story begins with these three women making their way to the tomb. I'll bet it felt a little bit like sleepwalking, or maybe like making your way through water with heavy weights strapped to your hands and feet. The Sabbath was over, and three of the women who had followed Jesus for years and who had walked with him all the way to the cross, who had supervised his burial, they needed to return to the tomb to finish embalming his body. So despite their mind-numbing grief and their desperately tired bodies, they got up before the dawn on the first day of the week and made their way to the tomb. You know that their feet were as heavy with grief as their hearts. But they did what we all do when grief visits. We wake up the next day, we take one foot and put it in front of the other, and we keep doing what we have to do. I can only imagine the thoughts going through their heads as they walked toward the tomb. What would they find? How would they move the stone? How could they face the body of their friend Jesus? Their eyes must have been raw from the crying. They thought he was the one. They believed with every ounce of who they were that he was Messiah, but Messiah doesn't die. When they arrived at the tomb, the huge stone had been rolled away. It looked empty, abandoned, and they peered around the corner into the tomb, and they saw not his broken and lifeless body as they'd left it on Friday, but a young man wearing a white robe, the Gospel of Mark tells us. He told them not to be afraid. But after everything they'd just lived through, pretty much the only thing they could feel was afraid. Afraid of the government, afraid of the Jewish leadership, afraid of each other, afraid of the future, afraid of this strange man wearing a white robe. And Mark's gospel tells us that the man said to them, "Jesus is risen, he is not here." Well, the "he is not here" part was pretty obvious. The stone slab where they'd laid him was empty, but he is risen? Unbelievable. So they turned away and they left because our gospel lesson ends. They were afraid. Now, let me ask you, if you were going to set out to prove something that seemed totally and utterly unbelievable, what would you do? The writer of Mark's gospel had that overwhelming task, that of telling a dramatic story that defied belief in every sense of the word, from start to finish. The grief and the pain, the political intrigue, the deceit and betrayal, the broken promises and shattered dreams, the angels, the stone, the crucified Savior, arisen? Unbelievable. Well, whatever it is one should do to tell this story so folks could believe it, the writer of Mark's gospel does not do it. Here we are on Easter Sunday celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, and Mark's gospel leaves out all the embellishments that could answer our questions. And I guess I wasn't the only one concerned about that. If you check any Bible, you'll notice that the text of Mark's gospel goes beyond the last verse we heard today. But those 11 added verses are not in the original manuscripts. They were certainly added later. Someone thought, like me, that Mark forgot a couple of essentials. Things like a little appearance of Jesus to Mary near the tomb. You'll read that in the Gospel of John. Or the enthusiastic rush of the women and Peter and John to run and tell everyone what the angels said, that Jesus was alive. You'll read that in Matthew's and Luke's Gospels. Mark doesn't even add in post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to try to underscore the fact that they had hard proof of Jesus' resurrection. That's in the longer ending of Mark's gospel. Nope. Here in Mark, there's one little guy in a white robe sitting in an empty tomb who says, Jesus has risen. And the women did not run to tell everyone what they knew. Instead, as you can see in Mark's Gospel, the original text of the entire book, recounting the life of Jesus of Nazareth and telling of his time on earth, his death, and his resurrection from the dead, ends with verse 8, which reads, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." I heard a story recently about a composer. Apparently, this composer was a man who created music on the piano, and he worked late into the night on his compositions. Every night, he was compelled to work until he could come to a logical stopping place, the end of a movement or the final measure of a piece. And because he tried so hard to bring closure to his work, he often spent the whole night working and slept well into the next day. And this habit drove his wife completely crazy. She preferred he work on a schedule closer to that of the rest of the world. It was hard for her to run the house, to manage the children, to cook, to clean, when she had to work around his sleeping form until mid-afternoon most days. The problem was that this man seemed hardwired to maintain this sleeping pattern. He just could not calm down for the night until he reached a logical stopping place in his work. And no matter what she did, his wife couldn't get him to change his sleeping schedule. Alarm clocks didn't work. Letting the kids run around didn't work. Repairs to the house, the washing machine running. Nothing seemed to be able to get him to go to bed at a decent hour and to get up to begin work with the rest of the world. One day, as his wife was lugging a full laundry basket through the living room, she glanced toward the piano, stacked with the tools of her husband's work, pencils strewn all around, unfinished scores in piles. He was upstairs sleeping. Then his wife noticed off to the side a piece of music, and she suddenly had a thought. She sat down at the piano and played the music. And she played and played and played until the very last note, which she did not play. Then she went back to her laundry. Sure enough, a few minutes later, she heard her husband clomping down the stairs, rushing to the piano and triumphantly playing that one final note. He couldn't sleep until it was finished. So every morning from that day forward, before she began her morning chores, the composer's wife would pull the piano bench up to the piano and play for a while, enough to perk his sleeping ears up, and then she'd get up from the piano without playing the final note. Problem solved. Why would the writer of Mark's Gospel tell such a compelling story of the life and ministry of Jesus and end in such a way that leaves us hanging? Why wouldn't he detail, like the other Gospels, every appearance of Jesus, every expression of faith by his followers, every ounce of proof that the unbelievable actually happened? After all, we need all the help we can get to believe that this man Jesus died, dead and crucified, spirit given up and gone, dead, just like we die, and then defied the grave and rose again. But the way Mark leaves things, well, it's not that easy. We want to shake him. Help us, Mark, because this is just so unbelievable. On this, the most triumphant day of our faith, the day in which we embrace a divine conquest over death and pain, I think it might be worth it to consider that perhaps Mark intended the ending just as he wrote it. In fact, maybe a trailing open end telling us what we know was certainly true, that Jesus' followers were so desperately afraid for their lives, so confused, so bewildered by this turn of events that they ran away, is really the best way to end the story. Why? Because that wasn't the end. If that early morning 2,000 years ago was the end, what we would have here is a very nice story about a great man who challenged a political system, who loved and healed people, a static, encapsulated piece of historical lore that we could pull out once a year, dust off, and read one more time, then carefully tuck it away until next year. Mark knew, you see, that the end of his written account was not actually the end of the story. In fact, what happened that morning in the cold breaking of the dawn was just the beginning. Recall that nobody who found an empty tomb that morning believed that the resurrection was even possible. The only way they came to finally understand that their friend Jesus was in actual fact who he said he was, the only way the unbelievable became real to them was when they began to allow the story to reach its way into their lives and change them, until they were absolutely and positively compelled to finish the story for themselves with their very lives. And so today, so far away from the events of the Gospel of Mark, if Easter will mean anything to you and to me, just like the first disciples, we're going to have to finish the story ourselves. This glorious day is not about new clothes for Easter or ham or Easter eggs. It's not about lilies or candles or beautiful music. We're not even here to try to imagine a Galilean man in rough burlap robes and rustic sandals making his way into our sanctuary to uncover archaeological evidence of resurrection. We're here because we're human and we hurt, because we need hope for our lives, because we believe, we know, that to finish this story means to allow the resurrected Christ to enter our lives, to transform our pain and our fear, to give us new life, relationship with God, and healed and whole relationship with each other. We're here because in our humanity, like the first disciples, we tend to turn from the tomb in utter defeat and crippling fear. But we have seen the power of the resurrected Christ in our lives and in the world. And what was once so desperately unbelievable has now become for us an urgent proclamation. What happens next is the real power of the Easter story. When we turn and leave this place, will the risen Savior take up residence in our hearts, shaping, changing, renewing, transforming, making us agents of healing and hope in the world? He is not here. He is risen, the man said, but that was only the beginning of the story. The women left, the text says, too scared to say anything to anyone. But in less than 50 years, the entire world would be transformed by the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. His radical mandate to love God and love each other, his offer of direct connection to God, the healing grace of his death and resurrection changed the women at the tomb and changed the world because those women had the courage to finish the story. Now it's our opportunity to turn from the empty tomb, maybe fearful and probably unsure, full of doubt, and allow the power of the resurrected Christ to enter our lives and transform them until we are absolutely, positively compelled to finish the story, until we can't rest, until the message of Jesus changes us and changes our world. What an unbelievable story. It began early that morning when 3 women, exhausted and grief-filled, made their way to the tomb. It began there, but it's not over yet. Someone has to tell the end of the story, and in fact, the end is yours to live. Amen.